All right, let's jump right in. We're about to unpack one of the most, well, frankly, one of the most bizarre stories in all of history. We're going to talk about how a private company, basically a group of English businessmen, somehow ended up conquering and ruling the entire Indian subcontinent. Seriously, it's an incredible tale of ambition, backroom deals, and the creation of an empire by a corporation.
I mean, just think about that for a second. How on earth does a private company conquer a subcontinent? This wasn't a government, with some grand plan for an empire right from the get-go. Nope. This was a business, pure and simple. So the big question is, how did they actually do it? Let's get into it.
So, let's meet the protagonist of our story, the British East India Company. It even had a nickname, John Company. It was set up way back in 1600 as a joint stock company. Now, what does that mean? Well, think of it just like a modern corporation you'd see on the stock market today. It had shareholders, a board of directors, the whole shebang. And their only goal really, was to make a profit. Now, at the very beginning, their mission was all business. They weren't thinking about conquests at all. All they wanted was a piece of the action, the incredibly profitable trade in Indian goods. We're talking about things like beautiful cottons, silks, and spices that people in Europe were desperate to get their hands on.
You've got to remember, in the early days, the company wasn't the only game in town. Not by a long shot. It was a super crowded market, and they had to scrap for every single advantage against their rivals from Portugal, the Netherlands, and especially France. Their goals were pretty straightforward. First, convince local Indian rulers to let them trade. Second, set up these fortified trading posts, which they called factories. And third, do whatever it took to beat the competition. The bottom line, driving every single decision, profit. That's it.
And then, everything changed. The whole story pivots to one place, Bengal. Now, at the time, Bengal was the richest province in all of India, just an absolute jewel. And it's right here, in the middle of arguments over trade deals and taxes, that the company's hunger for profit starts to look a whole lot like a hunger for political power.
Okay, so here's the turning point. The year is 1757. The event is the Battle of Plassey. But here's the thing. This battle wasn't really won with guns and cannons. It was won with a conspiracy. The company's guy on the ground, Robert Clive, cooked up a secret deal with the opposing army's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar. And when the time came, Mir Jafar straight up betrayed his own boss right there on the battlefield.
This one event, Plassey, marks a complete identity shift. Before this, they were just traders. After this, they were kingmakers. They literally put their guy, Mir Jafar, on the throne as a puppet ruler. This meant the company was now the real power in India's wealthiest province. The game had changed. The business of trade was quickly becoming the business of ruling.
And that power became official just a few years later, in 1765. After winning another key battle, the company got something called the Diwani of Bengal from the Mughal emperor himself. This was an absolute game changer. Why? Because the Diwani was the right to collect taxes from the entire region. Suddenly, this private company had a massive, steady income stream, money they could use to fund bigger armies and even more trade.
So, with Bengal as their home base and its taxes filling up their bank accounts, the company was ready to go big. They put together this really effective and pretty ruthless toolkit. It had three main strategies that they used to just systematically take over the rest of India.
First on the list was a brilliant little diplomatic trap called the Subsidiary alliance. It sounds nice, but check out how it worked. The company would go to an Indian ruler and say, "Hey, we'll protect you from your enemies." The catch? The ruler had to pay for the British troops living in his kingdom, get rid of any other European advisors, and, this is the big one, give the company control of all his foreign policy. It was genius, really. The company got a huge army for free, paid for by the Indian states themselves.
Next up in the toolkit was something called the Doctrine of Lapse. This was a policy that basically said if an Indian ruler died without a natural male heir, his kingdom would just lapse. It would automatically be taken over by the company. Now, this totally ignored the Indian tradition of adopting an heir, which had been done for centuries. So what was it really? It was an excuse, a political tool they used to just absorb state after state, a kind of legalized land grab.
Okay, so let's actually see what this looked like on a map. Take a look here at 1783. This is just a few decades after Plassey. The company's direct control is really just concentrated in the east, in Bengal, plus a few spots on the coast. It's a solid foothold for sure, but it's not an empire. Not yet.
Now let's fast forward just a bit to 1805. And wow, you can see how that toolkit has been put to work. Their influence has just exploded across the map. They've used wars and those subsidiary alliances to swallow up massive parts of southern and northern India. It's like ink spreading across a page.
And here we are by 1857, exactly 100 years after that fateful Battle of Plassey. The picture is totally different. The transformation is complete. Through a combination of direct conquest, those alliances, and the doctrine of lapse, John Company, a private business, remember, is now the undisputed master of pretty much the entire Indian subcontinent.
Okay, so they built the empire. But how in the world does a corporation, whose main job is to report back to its shareholders in London, actually govern millions of people? Well, the answer is they created a system that was brilliant at one thing: maximizing profit while taking on as little responsibility as possible.
The best example of this is the so-called dual system they cooked up in Bengal. It worked like this. The local ruler, the Nawab, was technically in charge of all the day-to-day stuff. Law and order, justice, all the hard work. The problem? He had no power, no army, and no money to do any of it. Meanwhile, the company had all the military might, and most importantly, they collected all the taxes. So it was the perfect setup for them. All of the power, all of the money, and none of the responsibility.
And to actually manage all this land, they had to build the framework of a brand new state. They brought in a professional administration, introduced their own legal ideas like rule of law, and of course, rolled out new tax systems. And all of these systems were designed with one single purpose in mind: to squeeze as much money out of the land as possible. The whole Indian economy was basically being rewired to benefit Britain.
But an empire like this, run by a corporation, it was a ticking time bomb. It just couldn't last. The very things that made the company so successful, the constant expansion, the relentless focus on profit, were also creating huge amounts of anger and resentment. And eventually, all that anger was going to explode.
And this timeline really sums up the whole story. It all starts in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. That's when the company becomes a real political power. Then, exactly 100 years later, in 1857, the Great Rebellion breaks out. This massive uprising just completely shatters the company's control. Back in London, the British government was stunned. They realized they just couldn't trust a private company to manage India anymore. So, in 1858, they stepped in and officially dissolved the company's rule. And just like that, the East India Company, as a ruling power, was gone. Finished. Everything, its armies, its lands, its entire system of government, was handed over directly to the British Crown. So the strange era of a corporation ruling a country was over, and the era of the formal British Empire in India, what we call the British Raj, had officially begun. Which brings us to a really important final point. The company was gone, yes, but the empire it built was still there, now just firmly in the hands of the British government. You could say the management changed, from a corporate boardroom to the Queen's government, but the underlying power structure was the same. So the question becomes, what did this new chapter, this era of direct British rule, actually mean for India? Well, that's a whole other story.